So welcome to our new and improved GB room. We are actually webcasting this meeting for the first time today from this room, so that's a first. Why don't we start with introductions? We'll go around the room. I'm Philip Fine, Deputy Executive Officer in the Planning and Rules Division at AQMD.
And I'm Karen Maliano, and I'm Chief of the Air Quality Planning and Science Division at ARB.
I'm Wayne Nastri, Acting XO, South Coast AQMD.
Henry Hoko, Assistant Deputy Executive Officer at AQMD.
Barbara Baird, Chief Deputy Counsel, AQMD.
Bill Wong with General Counsel's Office.
Jim Stewart, Angeles Chapter, Sierra Club.
Peter Okarowski, Consultant to Union Pacific and BNSF Railway.
David Rothbard, Southern California Alliance of Publicly Owned Treatment Works.
Rita Liu, Radtech International.
Mary Jane Olaso, County San Bernardino.
Bill Lamar, Executive Director of the California Small Business Alliance.
Carla Waleka for the Realtors Committee on Air Quality.
Peter Herzog with NAP, the Commercial Real Estate Development Association.
Tara Tesopoulos on behalf of the Orange County Transportation Authority.
Lisa Wonder, Port of Los Angeles.
Allison Teramoto, Port of Long Beach.
Thomas Yelenich, Pacific Merchant Shipping Association.
Chris Shimoda, California Trucking Association.
Tom Gross, Southern California Edison.
Brandon Matson, LA County Business Federation, BizFed.
Bill Quinn with SEEB.
Steve Smith, San Bernardino Associated Governments.
Michelle Hassan, Center for Community Action and Environmental Justice.
Noel Moico with SoCal Gas.
Shaw Devirian with the Social Economic Section, AQMD.
Adrian Martinez with Earth Justice.
Evan Gillespie with Sierra Club.
Ryan Stromar, AQMD staff.
Tracy Gauss, Planning and Rules Manager.
Elaine Shen, Socioeconomic Analysis with the District.
Sing-Mi Lee, Program Supervisor in Air Quality Modeling.
Mike Krause, Planning and Rules Manager, overseeing the AQMP.
And on the phone from the CARB location, who do we have?
Hi, here we've got and it's very impressive watching you guys webcast. It's a good, clear picture. We also have
Ariel Fiddledice.
Dave Edwards. That's it for here.
And how about at US EPA?
This is Laura Lawrence.
And Tom Kelly.
Okay, if that is it on the phone, again, welcome everyone. Advisory Group Meeting number 12 on this AQMP. First item on the agenda is minutes. Does anyone have any comments on the minutes that we sent out, I believe, on late Friday? If you haven't had a chance to review, you could still let us know if there's any changes, but we'll just take that as an approval. And then I'll just briefly go into some updates on where we stand on the AQMP process. We have the first slide presentation. So first, in terms of updates on US EPA actions, many of you may have noticed that on July 8th, EPA issued a final determination that we had, that our data met the previous PM 2.5 standards. This is the 1997 annual standard of 15 micrograms per cubic meter. As you know, that has since been revoked, and we have the 12 microgram per cubic meter standard that this plan is addressing, and also the 24-hour standard, PM 2.5 standard of 65 micrograms per cubic meter, which we have also met. And this was for the period 2011 through 2013. It took some time to get to this point in terms of this finding. But again, these are revoked standards, and we have new standards, 35 and 12, that we are addressing within this plan. This will be effective on August 24th of this year. Another update that just happened today is the US EPA issued their final rule on the Phase 2 heavy-duty truck greenhouse gas standard. And as you know, we had petitioned EPA to also consider an ultra-low NOx a heavy-duty truck standard of 0.02. So if you look at the language that they issued in that final rule, there's a lengthy discussion of our petition and the other comments they received in support of this standard, as well as some other comments, and they're signaling that they're going to start convening working groups and get started on that standard, hopefully right away. Just updates on the plan. As you know, we released the draft plan and Appendix 4, which is the control strategy, back on June 30th. And since that time, we have released some of the remaining technical appendices. I think the two appendices that are not available are Appendix 5, which is the technical modeling information. And then Appendix 6 is very close to being complete, but as you'll hear today, US EPA issued a pre-publication version of the PM 2.5 standard implementation rule, which we had only had a proposed version. So we've been poring over that. Barbara will talk about it in detail, but it may lead to some minor changes to what we had drafted in our Appendix 6. So that's really been the delay in Appendix 6. We want to make sure we get as much of that into this draft version as possible. We've conducted our 4 county public workshops, as well as additional workshops in Coachella Valley, and then one here at AQMD headquarters in the evening. All the presentations to those workshops are available online, and the one that was held here at headquarters was webcast, and that webcast has been archived. There's a lot of interest in additional public workshops, which we're happy to hold. We also have a requirement for regional hearings that will occur likely in November. So there will be plenty of more opportunities for meetings and public input as the process goes forward. And we've already received comments, not only at the public workshops, but also in writing, and we're already working on revisions to the draft in response to those comments. And as you know, we have kind of a soft comment period deadline of August 19th to allow us to, respond to those comments and make changes to the plan in time for a revised draft we have planned to get out in the September timeframe. But again, any comments throughout the process will be addressed in at least one of the subsequent revisions. So with that, that's all I had in terms of updates. Does anyone have any questions on that, or maybe wanted to talk about the EPA action today on the Phase 2 rule?
Sometime today,
Yeah.
is there going to be, sometime today is going to be the updated calendar going forward, or can you just confirm that the last calendar you're still on for that?
It's no changes to that previous calendar.
So the next draft is September-ish?
Yes.
Okay, yeah.
I mean, obviously
I don't
depends
know
on the
date.
number
Yeah,
of comments and how long it's going to take us to incorporate and make edits. But yeah, we're shooting for September for the next draft, which we'll call a revised draft.
Thank you.
Yeah, Evan.
Phil, what's the timeline for the other 2 appendixes? Appendices.
Hopefully within the next week or 2 at the outside. You have any specific, I mean, we might be able to share some pieces of it if there's something very specific you're looking at.
No, we're mostly interested in just trying to time out our own pacing for comments on the modeling and on the socioeconomic study. So just making sure we have enough time to.
All right, so the socioeconomic assessment is not an appendix, that's a separate document. We'll talk about the timing on that today. Okay. Any other comments or questions? Okay, with that, agenda item 2, Barbara is going to go over some of the elements of the PM 2.5 implementation rule that was recently issued by EPA.
Hi, everyone. This rule is still in pre-publication version, has not yet been printed in the Federal Register. I watched a webinar on this rule this morning, and EPA said they don't have a projected date for the Federal Register yet, but usually they only find that out very close to the time it's going to be published. The document is almost 600 pages, so it takes the Federal Register a little longer to publish those longer ones. But we're in the process of trying to adjust to it anyway. So in this presentation, I'm not going to go into everything in the rule. I'm going to be focusing on the things that are really directly relevant to this AQMP and not so much to what might happen in the future if we would need to request an extension of an attainment date or something of that sort. And I'm going to try to emphasize things that are different from prior practices that we've had here with EPA's blessing. So this part hasn't changed a whole lot, although I'll mention a brief change. All moderate PM 2.5 areas have to implement reasonably available control measures, which at minimum includes reasonably available control technology for stationary sources. They have to do this for all precursors as well as directly emitted PM 2.5. And the exception would be unless we demonstrate that a particular precursor does not contribute significantly to the air quality problem in the area. And I'll touch on that again in a minute. The regulation doesn't specify a threshold for significance. The proposed rule had touched on the possibility of using 3% of emissions as a threshold, but there's no threshold in the final rule. Also, when the agency looks at source categories to regulate for RACM and RACT, we don't have the ability to exclude a source category on the ground that that category is too small. We can still say that there's no technologically or economically feasible measure and that wouldn't be RACT, but you can't just say the category is too small. Now there's one saving grace on this, which I'll get to in a minute. I guess it's 2 minutes. So, as I said, RACT it has to be by definition technologically and economically feasible. The document mentioned that you need to consider a source for further RACT, even if it's installed controls recently, like within 3 years. However, that would affect your determination of what is or isn't feasible for that source. They allow the agency to consider things like cross-media effects, adverse effects on hazardous waste, water, et cetera, under the rubric of technological feasibility. They point out that social acceptability is not a criterion, and that we no longer need RACM for wildfire or prescribed burning. A couple points on economically feasible. EPA says that it's presumed that it's feasible for a source to bear similar costs as other sources in the same source category. And here's the one way that a source can be out of RACT other than being infeasible, is that if the agency can exclude any group of measures that collectively do not advance attainment by 1 year. And that's also coupled with the fact that RACT and RACM are defined as what can be feasibly implemented within 4 years. Now, if you need more measures than that to attain, you need measures after those 4 years, then you need to adopt them, and that's called additional reasonable measures. For serious plans, it steps up a level, and we need to adopt BACM, or best available control measures, and best available control technology. This is a different BACT from the one that's under our NSR rule, which you're all familiar with. But the basic concept is that sources have to do the best available measures, but still considering economic and technological feasibility. And the state is supposed to show how we apply more stringent criteria in choosing these measures than we do for RACT. BACM and BACT are different from RACT because we cannot exclude them just because they don't advance attainment. In fact, EPA says this requirement is independent of attainment. And then finally, if you're a moderate area reclassified as serious, then you have to implement both RACM and BACM, unless if you were to impose RACM, it would be incompatible with a later, more stringent level of control, and you make the source tear out what they had put in for RACM, and now they have to do BACM. In those cases, you can skip the RACM. So BACM has to be implemented also within 4 years, but it's within 4 years of reclassification as serious, as opposed to 4 years from designation as non-attainment. Again, If you need more measures than those can be done in the first 4 years, then you need to adopt them. And again, it applies to all precursors unless there's a demonstration they don't contribute significantly. So there's 3 separate types of demonstrations you can make for precursors that you believe don't contribute significantly to non-attainment. And I'm not going to go into these in great detail because we're probably not going to do the first 2 and may not do the third. The comprehensive demonstration, you can show that a particular pollutant doesn't contribute significantly at all, and then you don't need to regulate that precursor at all. You can do a more focused major source demonstration, and then you wouldn't need to regulate major sources of this precursor. And then finally, for NNSR is how EPA calls it, non-attainment new source review, you can show that new sources will not be significant and therefore can exclude that precursor from NSR. This really only comes up for us with ammonia because all the other precursors, which are NOx, SOx, and VOC, we consider significant. And again, they don't specify a threshold for significance. The new source review SIP is due 18 months after classification, and so that's August 14th of next year, but we actually are planning to bring this rule to our board in November, but it won't be effective until EPA approves it, or August 14th, whichever is later. And the main thing we have to do is reduce the threshold for major sources for PM2.5 and their precursors from 100 tons to the 70 tons, which is required for serious areas. And we also have to implement significant emission rates. These are all in the existing rule except for ammonia, and we're going to propose to set a 40 ton per year significance threshold. That means at what point is an increase big enough to trigger major modification requirements? And also we can rely on our previously approved PM2.5 rule, which we have 1325 until the new rule is approved by EPA. And importantly, the EPA position is, as it has been in the past, that a permit is subject to the version of the rule that's been approved as of the time the permit is issued, not as of the time it was submitted or as of the time it was deemed complete or anything like that. So just to highlight what's new in terms of excluding precursors, it used to be that you would show that the total major sources were insignificant and therefore it was assumed that you wouldn't get a lot more new major sources. Now EPA's taken an approach that says you don't look at the total existing sources, you look at what would be the impact of new sources. And they say 1 or more new sources, but unfortunately the guidance doesn't say how many more. So that's something that if we wanted to try to make this demonstration, we'd certainly have to work out with EPA. And the only primary reason why we would want to try to make this demonstration is the unavailability of offsets for ammonia. Ammonia is already covered under BACT under our existing Reg 13, so the control level wouldn't matter whether we exclude it or not, but the problem of if you did exceed 70 tons per year, you'd have to provide offsets, and where are we going to do that? In terms of reasonable further progress requirement, in past years, EPA has described this as sufficient annual emission reductions to constitute generally linear progress. In this rule, they expressly allow for a different measuring stick, which is stepwise progress, but that has to be adequately justified. And what the example they gave is, in the case of mobile sources, usually you have a new rule that goes into effect and then it's implemented as the fleet turns over on a generally linear basis. But in stationary source rules, you may have them go along at the same level and then all of a sudden you have a very large reduction in emissions when the rule goes into effect. And so they'll allow for that if you make an adequate justification that you're progressing expeditiously. But they do say generally linear progress is pretty tightly measured because you can't just say, well, it averages over 3 years. You have to look at individual years. Also, as response to one of our comments, they're allowing you to set an air quality target instead of emission reductions as a milestone for regional further progress. And those milestones are every 3 years, starting 4.5 years after designation and going one term beyond the attainment date. If you miss a milestone, you have to submit a new SIP within 9 months showing how you'll meet the next milestone. An issue that's been big for us in the ozone area, but not so much here for PM, is that reasonable further progress can only be met by reductions within the non-attainment area. You can't rely on reductions outside the area, even though those might contribute to your attaining the standard. You have to file a progress report 90 days after the milestone, and then if you fail to meet the milestone or if you fail to file a report, you have to implement the contingency measures that you've already adopted for ensuring that you meet your milestones. So I'll get to that contingency measures. Newly with this amendment, you have to submit contingency measures with the attainment demonstration for a serious plan. And that's what we're currently planning to go to the board in December. And the trick to that is contingency measures are supposed to be fully adopted and implementable without significant action by the state, and specifically without rulemaking action within 60 days of a determination that you failed to meet the milestone. So that's going to be very difficult for us to get done on the same time frame as the AQMP. In terms of what the contingency measure does, that hasn't changed so much. It has to produce approximately 1 year's worth of emission reductions or air quality progress. They do leave a little room for your ability to argue something less than 1 year. And again, as per existing policy, you can rely on excess reductions beyond the RFP or beyond what you would need to attain the standard from rules that are already either already in effect or scheduled to be implemented. And in the past, we've done that for relying on CARB's mobile source program, which provided reductions faster than RFP required, and used that as a contingency. Quickly as to conformity, it's already gone into effect for the 2012 standard, but you need to continue to do conformity for the 1997 standard, even though it's been partially revoked. So you might have to do multiple conformity findings, and that's until the area is redesignated as attainment. Phil mentioned that we've been found to have met the standard in terms of a clean data determination. That's different, though, from being redesignated as attainment. We have to make a separate submission to do that with the maintenance plan, and when that's approved, then we won't have to do conformity for the 1997 annual standard because it's been revoked, which I'll get to in a minute. And again, the same 70 tons per year is the threshold for general conformity. That's where a federal agency takes an action or provides funding, such as to the airports, things like that. One thing that we're not quite sure yet how this is going to pan out, usually you set a general conformity budget for prescribed burning. So federal agencies that implement prescribed burning in the forest areas, but they're saying that we must include wildland fire that may reasonably be expected. So one thing we need to find out is, do they mean by that actual wildfires? You have to implement transportation conformity emissions budgets for all precursors, or there's a separate demonstration you can make just for conformity that mobile sources of that pollutant of a precursor are not significant contributors. And then until you have an approved conformity budget or an adequate conformity budget for the 2012 standard, you have to continue to use any existing budgets that are already approved. So we've already talked about the clean data determination. The main thing that does is for the pollutants that you've been found to have clean data, you don't need to do any further planning, but If it's an obligation that's, quote, independent of attainment, you still, like as I mentioned earlier, back them and backed, you still have to go ahead and submit those if you haven't already. And you must still all implement all your measures committed to in the approved SIP, unless you amend the SIP pursuant to the appropriate procedures and safeguards. And finally, Phil had mentioned revocation. EPA's decided to treat this standard a little bit differently than it did when it revoked the earlier ozone standards. And they're only revoking the 1997 primary annual standard, and they're only revoking it once you attain it. So as long as you haven't yet been redesignated as attainment, then this standard still applies to you. And they're not revoking the other 1997 standards because those are retained as secondary standards for protection of public welfare. So they're not going to revoke them completely. So that's it. And I know that was something of a whirlwind tour through the new rule, but I tried to point out the areas that would be different from what we've been doing today and the challenges that we face, particularly with respect to getting the contingency measures. I would be surprised if those can actually be done by December.
Thanks, Barbara. So if your heads are spinning, try reading the 600 pages, and then, so this is a little welcome to our world. This is putting a plan together. You have to deal with all those 600 pages and all these idiosyncrasies. So this takes a lot of our time, and that's why, again, Appendix 6, we're trying to adjust in some areas to make sure we conform to these new implementation rules.
And if anybody understood enough to ask a question, I'd be happy to try and answer it.
Bill had his card up, and then we'll go to Rob.
Well, I'm not sure if I'm educated enough to ask a question, but I'm going to try. So you had me a little bit confused when you were talking about the precursors and the demonstrations you need to do, like ammonia. And I'm trying to figure out why each basin or each state would have to do their own demonstration. Is it because the inventories are different, or is it because of unique weather or atmospheric conditions?
Inventories are different and chemistry is different. So in some areas for PM 2.5, you could be ammonia limited, or you could be NOx limited, or some SOx is usually always a precursor. But in our area where ammonia has limited effectiveness, but it does have some effectiveness. So our current thinking, although we haven't really decided yet, is 70 tons per year is still a pretty high threshold for ammonia. I think the only facility that would ever start triggering that perhaps would be a new, very large dairy coming in. So we're still internally thinking about how we want to address it. Do we want to do one of those 4 options or 3 options there within the plan? So, but since we have 1325 coming up, we thought it's a good place to address it in our PM 2.5 NSR rule.
And if I could add on the dairies, there's an issue also because for many years EPA has been required to allow sources not to count, quote, fugitive emissions, unquote, towards their applicability thresholds. And unless you're a particular source category that is actually listed in EPA regulation, which wouldn't include, and that regulation was written back in 1978 before anybody knew anything about dairy emissions or anything like that. So those facilities are not listed in that list. So we're trying to work out, and we'll need to discuss with EPA how they consider dairy emissions under that principle and whether they ever actually would exceed 70 tons.
Rob.
You mentioned wildfires. It's a dynamic situation which actually is growing. We know that, and I'm just wondering for clarification. I mean, they're both, of course, obviously short-term effects as the fire is actually burning, and then there are long-term effects because now you've got potential fugitive dust problems in the barren soils, particularly in the deserts where there's a lot of wind every day. So I'm just wondering how we're handling that. Is that considered an exceptional event, or what you mentioned it, alluded to it? So I just wondering.
Yeah, there are requirements under Clean Air Act Section 319 for determining what is an exceptional event, and generally it's an event that is non-anthropogenic, and at least when it comes to dust, if the related anthropogenic sources are adequately controlled. And so a lot of times we can exclude wildfire days from our attainment, but you're right, they would have long-term effects in some areas where the pollution would remain.
Yeah, go ahead, Rob.
Okay, it's pretty fancy. But we have both types of fires. We have those that are caused naturally and those that are caused, and most of them actually are caused by man or woman. Humans, okay? So then how do you distinguish between that, et cetera, et cetera?
I think generally to this point, and again, EPA is amending their exceptional events rule as we speak. There's beginning workshops, I think, next month or maybe November. But generally all wildfires in the past have been considered potential exceptional events, whether it was caused by an arsonist or lightning. Whether that's changing or not with this rule, we don't think so, but there is that general conformity piece that maybe should apply to prescribed burning, because that is something that would be predictable, but it seems like the language says wildfire, which is clearly unpredictable and perhaps an exceptional event. So again, I think we need some clarification from EPA on some of that. Are you talking about like dust or resuspended ash? I'm trying to. Yes, I don't think that's come up yet where we've had a potential exceedance or a high day for those types of after effects, perhaps when wind kicks up. Usually a dust event, if we get high winds on a dust event, 25 miles per hour has kind of been the threshold. For PM10 at least, we've always applied for exceptional events if we did get an exceedance on PM10. And the same thing would likely go for PM2.5 if it did cause a 24-hour exceedance. And whether that's dust, naturally occurring dust, or ash from a fire, I think it would kind of be considered the same type of event. Any other questions? Encourage everyone to read that document, or wait till it comes out in the Federal Register. It'll only be 200 pages at that point. Just smaller print.
Small print, that's right.
Okay, with that, we'll move on to an update on some of the modeling that we've been doing over the past month or so, and Sang-Mi Lee will present that.
Afternoon. So I have, as usual, quick update on this modeling and inventory side. So first in emission inventory side, I have just two updates that I'd like to bring up. So first one is we finalized the so-called SIP set-aside accounts. So there are three items we list in the SIP set-aside associated emissions. The first one is general conformity related emission. General conformity is, as Barbara explained briefly, that is the action taken by federal agent. So if the federal agent is planning a project within non-attainment area, then that federal action has to conform the SIP/AQMP activity. So in other words, it should not interfere the effort to attain the standard. For that purposes, we set aside the nominal amount of emission to accommodate such federal actions within the basin. They are NOx, for example, it's 2 tons of NOx up to 2023, and then later on, the amount decreases a little bit. So for 2031, that is 1.5 tons of NOx, and the nominal amount of VOC has been set aside as again. However, these amount of emissions are evaluated based on the historical amount, amount of emissions and list of a project. So this should be reasonable enough to accommodate the projects, but at the same time, it is adequate enough not to hinder the AQMP effort. The second item is a so-called SIP reserve for technology assessment. So this account is, for example, let's say there is a rules or regulations that has been committed based on the new advanced technology. However, if the technology by any reason is not fully mature by the date of full implementation, then of course the emission reduction committed under such regulation would be a little slow down. So this specific accounts is set aside to accommodate by any future year technology maturity related issues. The third one is emissions from toxics phase out. One example for this is, for example, methylene chloride is a toxic air pollutant. And then AQMD, the district is currently developing a rule to ban the methylene chloride use. But then when you ban these toxic materials, then inadvertently there would be an increased VOC uses. I mean, the solvent that has more VOC emissions, meaning that you use less toxic materials. So inadvertently, there will be a nominal amount of VOC increase related with the toxics phase out. So that's the third item in the SIP reserve. So these three accounts are currently listed as a SIP set-aside account. But if any of you can foresee, for example, any federal actions that can be planned in next 5 to 10 years within our basin, then this is good time to come forward and work with us to make sure such projects conformed AQMP/SIP accounts, and then we can accommodate such accounts. And then second major update in emission comes from airport sector. So as of last week, we received the newly updated airport emissions. That airport emission includes all the commercial airports within the basin for the years of 2012 and 2040, and the in-between years will be interpolated if it's not specified. But this new update brought a nominal amount of increase in NOx emission. So for 2012, it's approximately half of a ton more emission is estimated compared to the draft release. But however, when it comes to future year, 2031, we expect it's going to be almost 3 to 4 ton. So 3 to 4 doesn't sound like a big number. However, if you consider that 2031 carrying capacity is 100 tons, still that is a substantial amount. So staff is currently working on to estimate the impact of those updated emission, and then we'll see how far we have to go with it. So the modeling side, so since mid-June, there have been a couple of updates in stationary source measures that has impacts on emission reductions. They are the CMB01, ECC02, ECC03. So the emission reductions associated with such control measures have been revised, and in total, approximately 3 tons of less NOx reduction under such control have been estimated by staff. So again, 3 to 4 ton is not a huge amount, but however, that has to be evaluated carefully, especially when it comes to 1 hour ozone attainment demonstration in 2022. We only used the 35 ton NOx reduction to show the attainment. So this 3 ton is approximately 10% of this reduction we used for 1 hour ozone. So staff still are working on to finalize or update this 1 hour ozone plan using this updated control measures. And secondly, the the modeling efforts undergoing is to evaluate the ammonia impact. As Barbara presented, that is a part of the final PM implementation rules. So we have to evaluate if ammonia, our currently understanding is ammonia is not a significant precursor to PM, especially if you consider that our design site for PM is Miraloma, and then emission characteristics of Miraloma is mostly, it is contributed by the dairy farms, which has abundance of ammonia emissions. And then if you progress toward the future air quality, and then we have a heavy NOx reduction, then in the future years, it will become more and more ammonia saturated. So in understanding wise, we have confidence that ammonia is not a major contributor to PM. However, we have to comply with this PM implementation rule. So you have to evaluate and then has to present using numerical simulations and emission analysis that they are actually insignificant or not. So, and then also, as Barbara mentioned, currently this pre-publication version of PM implementation rule does not show any bright line of threshold to determine insignificancy. It says approximately, probably 3% can be used, but it can be anywhere between 1 to 5%. But then still 3% to get on a rough idea, the 3% of national ambient air quality standard, meaning if ammonia contributes less than 0.4 microgram for annual PM, or if it contributes less than 1.05 microgram per meter cube for 24-hour PM, then it can be considered as insignificant. So STEP is currently working on to further evaluate this significance versus non-significance of ammonia to PM formation. And the next item is CEQA alternative modeling scenarios under development. Still, the management is reviewing and then coming up to finalizing the CEQA alternative scenarios, and modeling team is ready to cooperate with such decision. And as of this morning, we are currently downloading the lateral boundary values for numerical model. So the lateral boundary values for our modeling domain coming as a collaboration with CARB, and CARB finally advanced with their modeling with our updated working emission inventory. So they were able to share the later emission boundary values with us. We would not expect this revised boundary values affect basin significantly. However, it would have some impact to the other counties and basins outside South Coast Basin, much more so than the inside South Coast Air Basin. So next item is the updates on PM annual concentrations projected for the future years. So this is what we already have presented Part of it has been presented in the previous advisory group meetings as well as published in the draft version. But let me start a little bit of recap of where we are at with the annual PM concentration, annual PM prediction. So as you can see here are three major milestone years for annual PM attainment scenario. 2021 is moderate non-attainment deadline, which we presented in the past that practically it is not feasible to show the attainment by 2021. And therefore, 2025 is a deadline for a serious PM non-attainment status, which is what we are targeting for and then presented in the draft version of AQMP. And in between, there is 2023. That's the target year for 80 ppb ozone standard. So for those three cases, the annual PM concentration with baseline is projected as such, showing in the graph. So if no additional controls or measures were introduced, then baseline itself does not show the attainment. But the next one is, this AQMP committed attainment of 8-hour ozone by 2023, 80 ppb ozone standard. That requires approximately 45% of NOx reduction in 2023. When such amount of NOx reduction is implemented, then annual PM concentration expected to be 10.5, which is way below PM standard. However, for the purpose of complying with this EPA rules and regulations and procedures, we cannot claim the NOx reduction or emission reductions that proposed for ozone. We cannot claim all of those emission reductions toward the PM attainment because of 182E5 measure requirement that's allowed for ozone attainment, but not for PM. My apology here is a typo. This is not PM credible. It should be PM creditable. So when we use only PM, yes, they are credible. They are creditable. So when we use the NOx emissions, they can be claimed as PM credit only. Then as you can see, 2023, the reduction is a little bit short to show 12.0 attainment. However, it will get us there by 2025. So up until here is what we have presented in the past, and we have discussed extensively in the draft version. But then, recently, what staff have evaluated is the feasibility of BCM01, that is control on directly emitted PM from under fire, the charbroiler. So when you are talking about the BCM01, there can be basin-wide implementation versus localized implementation. Localized in the sense, Miraloma is our design site, meaning showing the highest value of PM 2.5. So what if this BCM01 have been implemented only around Miraloma, how much that impact can be? So if, just hypothetically, if we implemented this BCM01 and only 3 the forecast source receptor areas around the Miraloma, and combined with ozone, the NOx reductions, of which a credit can be accounted for toward the PM attainment, then as you can see in this yellow bar, it does show the concentration would go below 12.0 microgram per meter cube. And then staff have evaluated a little bit further this basin-wide implementation versus local implementation of BCM. And what you can see is 2025, both the basin-wide and then local implementation of BCM would get to PM 2.5 attainment. However, here is a big question. The feasibility of BCM01 and also the efficacy of ozone implementation plan, ozone attainment plan. So in reality, as I showed in the previous graph, in reality, if we get to the 80 ppb ozone attainment, that will way overshoot this annual PM standard. It's getting us 10.5 microgram. But then when it comes to BCMO, the 80 ppb ozone plan will ensure the annual PM attainment. But then when it comes to BCM01, just because it could be, it can be evaluated as RACM or BACM or RACT, whichever it is. So when it comes to evaluation of BCM01, is it really feasible? The first of all, so technologically, is it ready? So we currently have a contract with the CCERT, UCR. They are still evaluating the technical readiness of this measure or this control, and then they are still working on the testing, and we have not even received the final report for the testing of these new controls. And secondly, so if we want to include BCM01 as a full commitment, then regulatory, the timing-wise and implementation-wise, is it really practical and feasible? And third one is, if BCM01 is considered as a full-blown control measure, then mostly small restaurants has to bear the burden of implementing these control measures, and are they economically ready and capable of doing that? So there are several points that you have to reconsider the feasibility of BCM01. But then another thing is, if we commit early attainment, but then even in such a scenario, we have learned our lesson from this 24-hour PM attainment plan that we submitted during last AQMP. So meaning that the weather in the future years, nobody can guarantee which direction that will go. It might be a significant El Nino year, it could be La Nina year, so it could go either directions. So given that uncertainties, with some flexibilities and not fully make the hardwired deadline for the attainment is another thing to consider. So, and then third one, but then with all these uncertainties in the weather and then feasibility of implementation, but then still South Coast AQMD is committed to show the attainment of annual PM as expeditiously as possible using all the feasible measures. But at the end still, so that's a possibility is BCM01 could be the best as a contingency measure if this ozone attainment scenarios doesn't bring this PM attainment on time, then this contingency measures can kick in as to ensure the PM attainment. So up to here is the updates for the modeling and emission inventory side. I thought I was going to be quick, but I'm not sure.
So thanks, Sangmin. Let me just summarize where we are with PM 2.5. Right now, the plan proposes, and right today we're continuing to propose that we, again, ask for the bump up to serious based on infeasibility of meeting the standard by 2021. And when we're doing that, we'll ask for that 2025 attainment date. And the thinking behind that is first of all, if we attain the ozone standards, we'll more than attain the PM 2.5 standards by 2023, if not earlier, and you could see that here. But again, all those emission reductions may not be creditable because we may have to use some 182E5 flexibility for some of the further deployment measures if the money isn't in the bank, or we don't have everything that EPA needs to make those fully creditable. If we do have an attainment plan for ozone, we will get to PM 2.5 attainment. The question is whether we have a parallel effort to get these emission reductions from the only real place that we think we can get direct PM 2.5 reductions, perhaps feasibly, which is this underfired charbroiling. But the question is the timing of when we can implement that. We're still probably a year away from getting a technology assessment out of UC Riverside, and then there's some real affordability issues depending on what comes out of that assessment. So again, we think we're going to attain earlier than 2025. So the real question is whether we choose that 2025 attainment date, we would commit to implementing everything feasible. If these underfired charbroiling measures are feasible, we would implement. But again, as Sangmi said, given the uncertainties in weather year to year, do we want to choose an earlier attainment date? Would still be a serious area. Do we want to choose 2023 and then have to do a supplement later on if we didn't attain it? We always talk about the most efficient path to clean air, and this is showing that anything earlier than 2025 may require kind of parallel efforts to get to a standard that we may be getting to anyway with one path. So that's an open question, and like to take comment on that as well as any of the technical aspects that Sangmi went over.
Phil.
Yeah.
boundary layer. I mean, not boundary layer, boundary conditions. The ozone standard is very stringent for size of this basin and so on. We've discussed that many times in our meetings. How do we, and we know that over time, and we measure that out in the pristine areas, you know, as part of our visibility work. Pretty high ozone and getting higher. And we think a lot of that's coming from Asia. So how do we take into account intercontinental hemispherical increasing ozone as part of trying to meet the standard?
Let Sang-Mi answer that.
Yeah, I will take the first cut. So, Phil, if you'd like to add more, please feel free to do so. So currently, the way we calculate lateral boundary values do not have the increase of emission in the other part of the world. So in practical, as you pointed out, yeah, the emissions might be increased in Asian continent for next decade or so. So it is reasonable to expect that there will be some increase in it. EPA has a little note on the rules saying that if but for provision saying that if you can show the attainment with emissions originating outside the United States, not attainment, if you show that the non-attainment is contributed only by the emissions originating outside the United States, you can use that as part of an attainment demonstration. However, for the South Coast Basin, its ozone problem is coming both, majority of it coming from our own emissions. So there is a big uncertainties, and as you pointed out, there could be an increase in the impact in the future years. So what we do is, and just internally, STEP is analyzing the satellite data to show the trends in the last several decades, and it does show a nominal change over last several decades, and then try to see how that impacts the future or even current predictions. We included that discussion in the Appendix 5 as well. So for the official attainment demonstration-wise, it is not required and it is not included in the demonstration, but we do analyze such impact, and it could have impacts, but it's at the point, the uncertainty, the range of uncertainty is huge to estimate such increase at the point, but it's a good question.
So just to add, so even if there is an increase in this global background ozone, we still have that provision of the Act that says if but for international emissions. So the modeling guidance essentially says you set the boundary as it is in the base year and you assume it's the same going forward. But even if there was an increase, we still can cite that section of the Clean Air Act. But it is an issue for attainment that we need to always be looking at.
Yeah, I just had a quick clarification. Sorry, I thought it was next. The charts that we were looking at, they were all for Miraloma. Is that what I heard?
Miraloma, that's design value. So yeah, it's Miraloma driving that.
Thank you.
Sang-Mi, if you can make the demonstration or prove that you would be in attainment were it not for the influence of offshore sources, can you make the same demonstration that we would be in attainment were it not for state and federal sources?
We can try that. I'm not sure how it's going to fly with EPA in terms of approval. But that is something that we have done some preliminary runs on, and if anyone wants to see those results, we can share that.
Yeah.
Adrian had his card up for a while.
So I'm interested. So the middle chart looked at if the ozone strategy comes to fruition, and then also looked at BCM1. Is there any looking at if you converted some of the measures from 182 E5 or from the new black box strategy of the incentive to a more regulatory approach, how much would you have to convert to get the equivalent amount as BCM 01? So for example, if you did a regulation on water heaters or something else, what NOx reductions would achieve that same amount of
So
reduction?
this is just a very rough estimates, back of the pocket estimates, whatever you call it. But then let's say 3 ton of directly emitted PM is almost equivalent to 50 ton of NOx. So that means you include all this stationary measure related NOx as well as district mobile source NOx reduction all together. It might be barely equivalent to directly emitted PM control or somewhere similar.
So Adrian-
So this is all chemical potential is very different. So probably the amount of the incentive funding we are talking over here can be ginormous.
So that's why we look at direct PM or SOx as the way to get to PM 2. We could take the co-benefits of the ozone strategy because there's so many NOx reductions needed and committed to there, and that does make a difference for PM. But when you talk about an individual measure like hot water heaters, where the whole inventory is 3 tons a day NOx, it's not going to make a dent in PM. But what we've again, converting to the regulatory approach assumes there is a regulatory approach that is feasible by that 2023 or 2021 or whatever date you pick, and the plan has, in our view, included all the regulatory approaches that are available to us. So again, we've gotten comments and continue to encourage comments on other approaches, but the one we really analyzed for PM 2.5 attainment is BCM01, an unregulated source of a lot of direct PM 2.5 emissions that, you know, if you can do it feasibly and affordably, could lead to attainment in maybe 2023. But the question is, do you want to go in, put that in your SIP as setting that as your attainment year, and then committing to implementing that, which is going to be very expensive for especially small businesses, when we think we're going to get there anyway, if we can even get a fraction of what might be 182E5 funding for NOx reductions, which should get us there anyway. So that's kind of a question we hope to take comments on, because I think we're right on the edge there, and there's a few different ways we can go. Any other comments? Peter, your card is still up, but I assume you've got your answer. Okay, if there's no other comments on that, let's talk. Move on to agenda item 4. And while we know that that we have a comment period ending on Friday of this week, we have received comments already. We've received comments verbally in workshops. We've received several letters. We received letters this weekend. We haven't been able to, you know, provide responses to all of them yet, and we expect letters by Friday. But we thought what we can do is talk a little bit about some of the reaction and comments that we've had thus far to the release of the plan, either you know, in these comment letters, also in the press and editorials, and a lot of the discussion out there around the plan. So we thought this will probably be the meat of the meeting when we discuss some of the perhaps criticisms or comments or suggestions that we've received thus far. Again, fully knowing that we're going to get a lot more this week before Friday. So we've kind of divided it into different comment letters, and this will be a bit of a tag team between Henry and I and anyone else at AQMD staff that wants to respond to some of these comments. And I also want to give Karen a chance to talk about the comments CARB has received thus far on the state SIP strategy on the mobile source strategy. So we'll start with slides, and we'll turn it over to Karen. And I believe the first slide is something that Henry can handle.
The first comment deals with intelligent transportation and the operational efficiency of a transportation system. And the first comment is truck platooning. And we believe this comment is very appropriate. And actually, ARB is looking at that also as part of operational efficiencies when it comes to identifying additional reductions in co-benefits. The second item comment is on transportation system measures, and they are, again, similar to the discussion on operational efficiency, and they are included somewhat in SCAG's RTP, but we'll continue looking at these comments, these type of actions, and looking at how to quantify the benefits of them.
Again, it's going to be a bit of a tag team. I think this slide is mostly mine. So we received a comment letter from a wide range of environmental groups as a preliminary comment letter. They said they'll be submitting more additional comments as we go forward. But I wanted to address some of their comments. They essentially laid out 7 principles that they are asking that the AQMP adhere to. And if you remember early on in the process, we had laid out some plan objectives that we had hoped that the plan would adhere to as well. And honestly, there is some overlap there, but we think we can incorporate some of this in our revised draft as well. So the first comment was that the AQMB must be measurable, enforceable, and without any black box. And if you remember early on in the process, our governing board had given us direction that we should eliminate reliance on the black box to the extent feasible. And as we've discussed, the idea of the black box, which is further advancements in technology that you may not know what technologies are going to come about, or you may not know what they're going to cost. We think we've taken a step forward in this plan to lay out exactly the technologies that, as of today, we think can get us to attainment, and then again, putting a price tag on what that would cost to implement, which is a big step towards just putting everything in the black box and leaving everything to the future. Now, having said that, given EPA's strict requirements for creditability of measures, we know we will likely have to use some 182E5 flexibility for approval just because of the large dollar amounts involved. However, we think this is a step forward to be able to define pathways to attainment and what it's going to take. And I will mention that our update to our 1 hour plan, our 2022 deadline, just like PM 2.5, we're right on the edge of being able to show attainment with fully creditable measures without having to use 182E5. So we're still running scenarios there, but we're very close to that. Second comment is it should have early NOx reductions to meet the 2023 deadline. And one thing we want to remind everyone is that when you look at baseline NOx reductions going forward, we get significant reductions, almost 50% in the next 7 years or so. And that is due to already adopted rules and regulations, whether it's CARB's mobile source rules or some federal rules, but also our NOx reclaim amendment and a lot of our stationary source technology forcing measures that were passed over the last 5 to 10 years, 1147, 1111, 1110.2. So those are leading to emission reductions going forward from regulatory measures that are leading to a significant reduction by 2023. And so there are early reductions by 2023, and then those continue into 2031. And we are committing additional measures in this plan to further reduce NOx emissions on stationary sources and to a small extent mobile sources by 2023. Third comment was the plan should address disproportionately low income and communities of color. Again, this is an attainment plan, but we don't leave that out. We have an environmental justice analysis that's going to be included in the socioeconomic report that looks at the impact of the plan and whether there's any differential in air quality improvements to environmental justice areas versus non-environmental justice areas. We have Chapter 9, which is our toxic control plan, which focuses largely on facilities and local impacts of those facilities. And also note that a lot of the mobile source measures that we're proposing, whether it's zero emission or even near zero emission, will include a lot of reductions in near source impacts around freeway corridors or the ports as they implement the cleaner standards and cleaner engines. So while we do have that analysis in the plan, it's not the primary objective, but it is a big consideration. And again, implementing what's proposed in the plan will have huge benefits in those areas. Next two comments I will let Henry handle since they deal with more on mobile source side.
I get the one with the big dollars and uncertainty. So this question has come up throughout the AQMP public workshops, and comments were heard from stakeholders from all perspectives. And I wanted to step back a little bit and explain what the analysis in the draft AQMP contains. The 10 to $14 billion over the next 15 years. What the staff has done is taken a look at ARB's mobile source further deployment measures. Only those measures and not the remaining measures that have regulatory or other types of actions. But looking at the further deployment measures, ARB has indicated that the actions needed to get those emission reductions would be based on 4 concepts. One is incentives program. 2 is to develop regulations as new technologies are being deployed, and there's a path for a regulatory approach. 3rd is looking at the benefits of operational efficiencies and being able to quantify those benefits, emission reduction benefits, and have a demonstration to US EPA that they can be real surplus and permanent and be creditable as part of the SIP. 4th is looking at intelligent transportation system, connected vehicles, autonomous vehicles, and how those co-benefits of those technologies can be quantified. So what we've done in the AQMP is take a look at, well, what's going to be, if incentives program is the main action, what would that funding level be? And so what you see, the 10 to $14 billion over 15 years is upper limit estimate of what the funding level could be. And as other actions occur under those, in implementing the further deployment measures, we expect that that funding level will come down. So this is kind of the maximum. It's a what if, and it's over 15 years. Now we took an average of $1 billion per year. We know we're not going to get $1 billion next year, maybe not in 2 or 3 years, but we also know that when we look at our funding levels to date, it can ramp up to that $1 billion per year over the next 5 to 15 years. So we're taking a look at that. We made a presentation at our Mobile Source Committee back in mid-July regarding moving forward on the funding plan and on actions to securing the funding, and staff is working on developing a funding plan to be a company to accompany the AQMP as we move forward with the plan. And that work is going to be in parallel. So Wayne, did you want?
I would just add that on the funding aspect, you know, while we originally talked about going to Congress and looking at other sources, I guess I want to be very clear. That's not the only opportunity that we're looking at. We're looking at all available mechanisms and opportunities. We're evaluating all existing authorities. We're looking at what potential authorities might be necessary in us to take further action on our own. So there shouldn't be an assumption that we're looking at only one pot. We're looking at a whole variety of various issues, and we hope to come out soon with what those options will be. And we'll be sharing all of that with you as we work forward, because this is going to take a big concerted effort on a lot of everybody's part across the local, state, and federal government. So we recognize it's not all going to be from the feds, that we're doing everything can to identify all those different sources, and we'll have it shortly.
Thanks, Wayne. And we're also looking at non-incentives-based programs, such as what has been done historically with the Clean Air Action Plan, those things that have resulted in significant emission reductions, and the funding is not from the public side, it's more of a public-private partnership in those situations. So those are other types of funding concepts that we're looking at. So you just call them incentives concepts and not just purely funding. The next comment is regarding zero emission technologies and prioritizing those technologies. We do strongly support going to zero emission vehicle technologies where it's feasible, and a lot of the technologies are maturing at this time and need to be commercialized. So as we see that come forward, we will prioritize it. But in the near term, really, what we're looking at is near zero technologies. That's why the district, along with other non-attainment areas and states, have advocated to EPA for ultra-low NOx emission standard for trucks, and know that ARB will be looking at petitioning EPA for new locomotive standards and new other off-road emission standards that will be much tighter than today's standard. So we'll continue to look at zero emission technologies as they improve. And part of the thinking is that when we look at our control measures, there may be a need to put a little bit more discussion regarding where we see zero emission technologies.
Okay, I'll take the next one. I do want to mention that as we receive comment letters on the AQMP, we are posting them online and making them available for everyone to see, no matter what type of comment letter we get. The next comment was looking at requirements for, say, solar or electric hot water heaters or zero emission technologies in those applications. Also looking at diesel backup generators and new fossil fuel power plants. So currently in the plan, we address these sources under ECC 03 and CMB 02 to seek that accelerated deployment. Right now, we're looking at potential incentive approaches. But because of this comment and other comments we've received, we are going back to the drawing board and seeing if there are regulatory approaches that could be feasibly implemented when it comes to these residential and commercial sources. On backup diesel generators, we're looking very hard at that as well, and we just need to see what types of emission reductions we can get feasibly through those types of measures. In some cases, say for solar hot water heating, it is zero emission, but we do have rules that require all new hot water heaters to meet certain low NOx standards. And so you start getting diminishing returns going forward. It's very hard to require every homeowner to replace their existing hot water heater with a new type of system. Very hard to enforce, even if you did pass that rule. So a suggestion was made at point of sale or for new development. And so we're looking at that and seeing what the emission benefits would be if we did have a rule like that. In terms of new developments, a lot of the new developments are already incorporating all of this technology due to Title 24 requirements. But we are doing that calculation. We're in the process of doing that, and we will be proposing perhaps some changes to those measures when we do find feasible reductions on the regulatory side. No matter how small, at least it'll be out there as a point of discussion. On diesel backup engines, there's some more work that needs to be done about what types of applications can actually be replaced with, say, battery backup or other types of fuels. And so we're doing that work now. On power plants, we don't really have that approval authority of power plants. They're within reclaim. They're all at backed or barked when it comes to NOx emissions. But I think the landscape has changed quite a bit in terms of the need for new fossil fuel power plants in the basin. There's not a lot of proposals out there for new fossil plants that are going forward at the moment. Okay, so the last comment in this letter, I'll turn it back over to Henry.
Thanks, Phil. This one, a comment is in regard to our authority to adopt fleet rules and to look at our indirect source authority. And this comment pertains to the facility-based measures as well as MOB 09, and which is on heavy-duty vehicles. We indicated in these measures that we want to start a public process to look at actions that can be quantified and be SIP creditable, and those reductions be taken as part of rate of progress or identified in our next AQMP. And in that discussion, we also indicated that we will be looking at all opportunities to reduce emissions from through these measures, and those include developing other enforceable mechanism and any authority, regulatory authority that we have. Based on comments received, we will be updating these measures to include a discussion that would be to, as we develop, staff work through the public process to identify actions that we will keep in mind the need for perhaps an avenue for regulatory pathway. And we will set a date certain in which we will come back to the board with a recommendation, either that we're proceeding successfully through the first path of identifying actions, or there may be a need to ask the board to start the regulatory process. But throughout our public process, we have no other public process but a rulemaking process. So even during the public process, we are evaluating what are the most cost-effective actions and what are the mechanisms to make those actions enforceable.
Okay, I'll move on to a few more of the letters we've received. This will probably be the last time we can go through. Yeah, we'll go to Chris in a second, but this will be the last time we'll be able to have enough time to go through letters individually. I think from this point on, we'll have to start doing it in documents and subsequent drafts. But yeah, Chris.
Just want to clarify on the last slide, was that supposed to be MOB 08? 08, okay. Right.
Okay. All right, so our next, oh, sorry, Michelle.
Hi, just a little bit of a clarifier on the environmental justice point of the letter. It was really more in reference to the district's Title VI obligations, and in as such, it makes it almost difficult to properly assess the plan and contribute meaningful comments that would assist you without a proper socioeconomic assessment, without really a proper analysis of the disparate impacts on communities of color. It is a Title VI obligation. It's not just a whim question. It's a question about obligations. And number two, in as much of many of the measures that you're talking about, I'm hearing that you are really working on trying to look at the balance between regulatory incentives, looking at different resources for funding. I'm hearing there's a lot of work going on, and I'm just curious to know that you're doing so much. Does that mean maybe we should push back the deadline? Because the deadline for comments is August 19th, and it seems like there's a lot more information that could really be valuable and assist the public interpret and contribute to the plan in a more meaningful way.
So this is an iterative process. So we do plan to release a revised draft based on what we're getting thus far, and there'll be another opportunity for comment after that. But you know, we want to have that iterative process, and hopefully at the end of the day, we'll converge on something that has some degree of consensus. In terms of the socioeconomic analysis in EJ, that's just not done yet. But we do plan on doing that. That's part of the objective and the plan and the outline for the socioeconomic analysis, and you participated in some of those meetings. It just has to trail a little bit, and then obviously because it's iterative, that changes a little bit based on any changes we make to control measures, and you know, it's difficult to pull it all together. That's why we want this iterative process to try to converge on a final document.
And also, I want to add that, so we're going to hold the third socioeconomic assessment EJ working group in September. So the final day is not set yet, but then we'll do that. And also just to let you know that we will be including race and ethnicity in the screening process.
So you're right. We are trying. We're taking another crack at some of these regulatory approaches. We do feel like we went through this for well over 2 years and left no stone unturned. But based on comments we've received, we're going back again to see what we can squeeze out of the stone. So, you know, hopefully once we get all the comments in, all the suggestions in, we'll go back to the ones I mentioned and other sources and see if there's anything there, and let all the stakeholders know that what it would look like if we were going to perhaps do a regulatory measure. How many NOx reductions would we get? What would it cost? What are the feasibility issues? And have an open discussion on that. Okay, so the next comment letter was pretty specific. Again, looking at methane and carbon dioxide and VOC emissions. Obviously, this plan is an attainment plan for criteria pollutants. We'd love to get GHG reductions wherever we can, take co-benefits from GHG programs, but it's obviously not the primary goal. We need NOx reductions. So a lot of the comments in this letter, and I won't go into too much detail, focused on specific measures or specific types of sources and methane and carbon dioxide and VOC emitting industries, as well as some comments on BCM10 and some education and outreach programs, and then some dust pollution from resuspended dust. So I won't go into too many details on this one, but you all have the handout or can look online and see what our preliminary response to those comments are. The next comment letter looked for technology neutral and performance-based control measures for organic materials in the district. And again, we don't have any. We have very small emission reductions associated with BCM10, and part of the commitment is to explore some of these emerging technologies. There's a lot of changes happening in the waste industry in terms of organic materials and composting, or using it for biogas or biofuels and all these alternative uses. And BCM10, along with some of our other measures, are taking a very close look at that. In fact, one thing we're looking at is actually pulling out all the issues around organic materials and potential biofuel production, and maybe in a separate measure. And because right now it's scattered amongst 3 or 4 measures. And then a comment about aligning with Cal Recycle regulations when looking at the effects of composting and other green materials. So again, we're in contact with Cal Recycle, and BCM10 is actually proposing to do some of that work. So comment letter number 5 is looking at, what if there's a fee imposed on development or redevelopment in our service area? We should be a little more, clear in the intent and scope of our ISR rule, looking at EGM01. And I'll answer for Henry. He can chime in if I get something different here. But, again, as Henry said, EGM01 and the MOB1 through 4, what we're proposing is convening a working group process to see what are the best approaches to addressing these sources. And if that turns into, if one of the best approaches to make it enforceable is regulatory, if one of them is a fee, then we would go in that direction. If there's another direction that comes out of the working groups, we'll go in different directions. But the key is to make it enforceable and creditable under the SIP. Another comment was when we're proposing BCM03, again, with no emission reductions associated, but we do want to take another look at resuspended road dust. And this comment just looked at the other restrictions on road dust and for water runoff purposes, and just encouraged us not to be duplicative with some of those other requirements. Yeah.
So on your working group, just on timing, I'm just a little confused. Is the working group designed to provide you with input before the release of the AQMP? Or is it something that's, you said time specific for the board, that would be after the AQMP?
Bill, this would be after the AQMP, after these measures, if they are adopted by the board, we'll be implementing them.
That doesn't mean we're not taking input on how to shape these measures within the AQMP also. Okay, so I think we're on comment 6. I'll let Henry handle that.
So, and this comment is very specific to ARB's advanced clean transit rulemaking that will be coming up over the next year or so. And the comment included that the use of battery, electric, or hydrogen fuel cell buses is not cost effective. And we are providing this comment to ARB. It's part of the comments that we have heard jointly with ARB about when zero emission technologies can come on board and the timeline for it. and ARB's staff has not proposed an implementation schedule for this, and that will still be part of the public discussion. But we strongly support the discussion so far about near zero technologies in the interim as it transitions to zero emission buses. The second comment is again similar to the comment regarding EGMO1, which is in addition to compared to the other measures, EGMO1 is a little bit more specific that we have to evaluate San Joaquin's Rule 9510 and whether that's rule framework or concept can apply in the South Coast or not. And that's under state law. We need to look at this. And so to narrow the description at this point, we really can't do that because it is to look at the rule in general as part of all feasible measures. So we still have to look at the broad set of categories that are facilities that are in 9510. And then on the next slide, this again applies to EGMO1 and local jurisdictions' purview over land use, that we are not looking at anything that will interrupt that process, but really do want to look at the way San Joaquin rules is set up and whether that applies in South Coast or not. And then there's a comment that need for CARB and US EPA to demonstrate their commitment to incentive-based mobile source measures and to accelerate zero and near zero technologies. And we've been working with ARB very closely on this, and both our agencies staff were supporters of incentives-based programs, and EPA is also in the fact that they have the DERA program that's ongoing, and they have other programs that come on and off, but we really do need more funding incentives from all levels, and not just state and federal, but even on a local level. And the next comment is on the $14 billion funding source, and as I mentioned earlier, I think that was addressed. And then a question about, or a comment about the time that either a backstop measure is needed or a TBD measure is identified to be more cost effective than one of the currently quantified measure, that we remove the TBD measures. We strongly believe the TBD measures are needed because they help implement at least on the mobile source side, a lot of the further deployment measures that are identified in mobile source strategy. And I believe that is the last of the series of comments of the 6 comment letters we received.
So that's what we received. Let's take a few questions. This would probably be the agenda item for general comments too that anyone has on the plan at this point, but I also want to give Karen a chance. But let's take a few questions before Karen speaks. Yeah, Jim. They came really late this weekend. Can you mention this? Okay. Okay.
This should be good. Yes, okay, great, thank you. So my question has to do with the credibility, I guess credibility and creditability of these incentive measures in terms of the fact that we clearly know that if there is, a regulation in place, then that makes the response much more responsive to incentives. But if there's no backup, there's no regulation in place, how can you demonstrate to anyone's credibility that these incentives would work? I mean, do you have examples of many districts across the country that have done these kinds of things? I mean, I'm thinking about everything from the mobile source measures to the gas water heaters, for example.
We do, in fact, one of the comments made by our board members at the Mobile Source Committee was to put together some information on our current existing funding and funding we have to date. And numbers add up to over $1.5 billion over the last 15, 16 years. And you've seen the success we have with the Moyer programs, as well as Proposition 1B. And we've been working very closely with the ports and implementing Clean Truck Program where there's a funding element. So these are actually the information that our board requested to show that we are able to run funding programs, and the funding programs are very cost effective. And so we'll be putting that together as part of this funding plan.
And Jim, I do want to mention that, I mean, the regulatory programs are in place, right? They just don't get us there. Now, we can talk about whether you can build upon those and accelerate those in other ways other than incentive funding, but we're already getting significant emission reductions from the regulatory programs that are already in place. Just because they're not a new measure in this plan doesn't mean they're not getting significant reductions because they were adopted before this plan is being proposed. So it's not an either or, it's a both, and we're doing as much as we can on both fronts. It is a significant challenge. And there is another example Karen knows more about, of another county in California that has an attainment strategy that is based on incentives. Maybe Karen can mention that.
Sure. So one of the areas of the state that is currently non-attainment for the 12 microgram standard is the city of Portola up in Northern Sierra. And a significant piece of their non-attainment problem is older uncontrolled wood stoves. So we've been working closely with both the district and US EPA to design an incentive program that will help people turn over those stoves to newer, cleaner, more efficient ones, and ensure that that program itself is creditable within the SIP itself. So I think that's one example of an area that we're working closely together on that can transfer over to what we'd be looking at as part of this program. And then I think just expanding upon what Phil had mentioned in terms of the core regulatory nature of the programs, part of it is indeed that our existing regulations continue to provide tremendous further reductions going forward. And so it is a regulatory program that is driving things. But also when we look at the new measures, especially ones that are introducing and requiring even more stringent engine standards, whether they're for cars or trucks or off-road equipment, those are really the regulatory anchor. And then what we're looking at is incentive programs provide that last increment to sort of pull forward and accelerate the penetration of those vehicles themselves.
And I would just add that on the mobile source side, I mean, we've seen programs like DERA that have been very successful, and the whole goal is to accelerate those benefits as opposed to waiting for the time that it would take for whether it be fleet turnover or not. So we absolutely understand the critical nature of a strong regulatory program, and they're the basis for the incentives. We've got to have both. So that's what we're working on.
I just want to add one more example. As fleets are complying with the truck and bus regulation, as many of you know, by 2023, almost every heavy-duty truck will have to be a 2010 engine standard. And so we have been talking with ARB about ways to incentivize those fleets as they comply with the truck and bus standard to purchase the ultra-low NOx engines instead of the 0.2 gram, the 2010 engine standard. We already started such incentives program through the MSRC for transit buses and refuse trucks.
Well, they should be going electric.
Rita? Just maybe speak louder.
Closer to your mouth. Let's see that.
On comment letter number 4, there was a mention of VOC sources. Do you know what those were? The first part of the comment letter?
I believe it was pretty general, but from some of the other comments, I think it was looking at oil and gas sector to some degree. Bill? I know we're having technical difficulties here.
Meetings, but I just don't recall. South Coast is looking or estimating somewhere between 11 and 14 billion dollars. What is CARB's estimate on the incentives for your sources?
It's embedded within the numbers that the South Coast has
It's part
put
of the same
forward.
number?
It's within that same number. So, much of that is related to incentivizing mobile sources.
Okay, so the 11 to 14 billion is AQMD and ARB.
Correct.
Yeah, thank you.
Evan?
A question about the ports. So it looks like there's a chart that shows emission baseline for the ports, and then all of the emission reductions from the ports are TBD. And I'm wondering, is the port, it seems like the port is going to present, or the port will come up with a reduction, and certain percentage of reductions from the port, or are we to infer from what's in the document so far that we can meet the standards without further reductions from the port?
So again, as I mentioned, the facility-based measures are to help implement ARB's further deployment measures. And so the 5 major sources, mobile sources at the ports, are actually embedded, all of them in the further deployment measures in the mobile source strategy, always from the marine vessels and the harbor craft that are in the national and international sources to off-road equipment that are the cargo handling equipment. And then you have the on-road trucks, which are part of the heavy-duty further deployment measure in the mobile source strategy. So we didn't want to put down numbers for reduction because they're already reflected in the mobile source strategy.
Yeah, Chris?
So the slide that talks about coming back to the board with date certains on the MOB 1 through 4 and MOB 8, do you anticipate that the dates are going to be harmonized between all the different measures, or you're going to select different dates for MOB 1 versus 3?
At this point, we don't have we're probably looking at about 1 year out, but we will be reporting to our board through the various committees on an ongoing basis throughout that period of time. So no specific, 2 months, 6 months, 1 year, just 1 year.
There's no other questions. Karen, you want to talk a little bit about the comments you received on the state strategies?
Sure. So as you know, we released a draft of the state SIP mobile source strategy in May of this year. We received 24 individual comment letters, and those are also all available on our website for those of you who want to be able to go and look at all of them. Rather than going into detail on all 24 of those, though, I wanted to just give a sort of a brief overview of what some of the common themes that we were seeing in those letters themselves. First, sort of an encouragement of looking at both zero and near zero technologies, and also several letters that encouraged us to continue to recognize a role for natural gas as part of that process. We've talked a lot about incentives here today. The comment letters did recognize the role that incentive programs can play in achieving the region's air quality needs, but also did encourage us to continue to work on a greater level of specificity, both in terms of defining what the funding needs are, but also the funding sources. And if you've heard Henry and Wayne and Phil talk about, that is indeed the next step in terms of actually putting together more specifics on that. We also had comments that encouraged us to continue to look at the economic competitiveness of the region and also making sure that we prevent stranded assets as we look at rolling out various regulations as part of the program. Recommendations that we continue to look at emission inventory improvements, I think especially in some of the freight sector categories. It's one we often have, but is one that we continue to work with industry on developing those improvements. And then support for federal and international standards and action at those levels, in addition to what both of our agencies are doing. And just to echo what Phil had said at the outset in terms of what EPA has been signaling today with their release of the Phase 2 GHG rule, is a fairly extensive discussion about the needs that California has, as well as the need for really a comprehensive NOx reduction strategy that is synchronized between what ARB does and what US EPA does, and the fact that they are looking at moving forward on starting to work with us on that process. And I think ARB's advocacy sort of behind the scenes with EPA over the last couple of years has been very beneficial, as well as the petition that the South Coast AQMD has put forward. We're all fully recognized in this. And so, as I said, we're very much encouraged about that. Maybe just in terms of our schedule, we're looking at having a workshop on September 1st in Sacramento that will be webcast. We've participated in the South Coast District's workshops, and as there are more going forward, we'll continue to partner with them on that. And then we're planning on having the state strategy discussed at 2 of our board meetings. First in December as more of an informational item, and it'll be a continued opportunity for both our board and the public to provide comments on what we're looking at in September. Did I say so? September, and then coming back in December, which is where the board would then act on the strategy itself and provide the specific commitment of the reductions that would be in the South Coast SIP as well as any other regions of the state.
Questions for Karen? Yes.
For those of you who missed my quick presentation at the socioeconomic committee level, I just want to reiterate we are number 50 out of 50 of business-friendly states. So when we're looking at where we sit in regulatory environment, please do not put us at a disadvantage to the other states. I know that we have to comply with the EPA, with ARB, but don't make it worse than it already is.
Okay. Michelle?
Yeah, I'm sorry, I can't help but respond. California is one of the only states in the country where manufacturing is increasing. Our jobs are increasing. We may be 50 out of 50, but our economy is thriving and growing, and it's not because of our regulations or lack thereof. I think we have a great opportunity right now to look at green jobs, the green economy, and I think the Air Quality District can really lead the way. So I think that's an opportunity we should be looking at instead of rhetoric that isn't coming to fruition, right? We've been hearing the threats of losing jobs for 20 years, and they're not going anywhere. Jobs are increasing.
Well, they may be increasing in some regions, but we have one of the highest poverty rates in the country in San Bernardino County. And I'm very concerned about our population.
And the jobs are increasing the most in San Bernardino County. It means they're underemployed. It's not a lack of jobs, it's warehouse jobs.
I think Bob had his card up in between there somewhere.
I really had intended to say anything on this topic today, but it's kind of hard to resist. You know, I do think it's healthy to talk about the job impact because there are always trade-offs. and we can choose ways that are less impactful and ways that are more encouraging of job formation. I just have to say, in light of the recent comment, that if we take a long view and go back to the 70s, at least in the LA County, Long Beach area, and I don't have data for the other counties, I'm sorry, but I do for the others, for LA County and Long Beach, manufacturing jobs represented 24% of employment in that region in the 70s, and it's about 7% now. So yeah, I hope manufacturing jobs are increasing, but we have a long way to go to return to where we were. I don't think anybody has any illusions that we're going to return to where we were, nor is anyone saying that that job loss was solely attributable to clean air regulations. And I think most in the business community would say clean air regulations are a priority, and that can encourage job formation if we do it right. But we have to be careful about how we do it, because it also can, we do it wrong, it can make it very difficult to capture the full opportunities to restore manufacturing to the region that now exist, when in some respects our region becomes more competitive. Let's capture those opportunities by being careful and doing it right. And I think, unfortunately, it's too easy to go to one categorical extreme or another. And this is something that requires some nuanced thinking about instrument choice, but it's not simple. And we unfortunately are in a position where even just for sustainability, we need jobs of certain types here in energy production, in particular, because we don't want to have to ship in or either products or energy that we could produce here. That's a more sustainable future for us if we can co-locate jobs with demand. So I do think, and undoubtedly in the socioeconomic analysis, you'll be looking at these issues, which is important. But I really couldn't leave unchallenged the statement that we haven't lost jobs in the recent past, or that they're growing in this area. It's, in my view, that's not what the data show.
That's correct. In fact, the manufacturing jobs that we are getting are primarily assembly. Additionally, if you had heard my presentation, I work with site selectors who represent Fortune 500 companies who are absolutely not interested in putting California on their spreadsheet at all. If you would like to attend some of those meetings with me, I am happy to have you come.
Let me just say that we're here to focus on the AQMP.
Yeah.
We appreciate all the perspectives that are being brought forward. Believe me, the staff appreciates both the business perspective, the environmental perspective, the community perspective. That's why all of you are here today. So we appreciate the comments, but I do want to make sure that we have the ability to finish our agenda. So we're going to move on. And
That
I think
sets up our next presentation very nicely. Elaine Shen will talk about our update on our draft socioeconomic report.
All right. So thank you all for being here today and staying here for the last agenda item. So first thing first, everybody wants to know when you are going to see something in writing. So we plan to release the preliminary draft of the socioeconomic report analyzing the draft 2016 AQMP. So we're going to release that by the end of this month, so in about 2 weeks. And our staff is working really hard towards this goal. And although we would like to include as many components as possible into our preliminary report, and at this point, we believe that we can include the preliminary incremental cost as well as the preliminary public health benefits into this preliminary report that we will be releasing in about 2 weeks. And so for the cost part, we will break it down to include both incentives that in our current modeling, we will be assigning them as coming from federal, state, or local sources. Then, of course, as the plan develops, if we identify public-private partnerships, as Henry mentioned earlier, then we will change our modeling assumptions and approaches. And so net of these incentives for the remaining incremental cost, they will be incurred by private industries, consumers, or public agencies. And so for the preliminary public health benefits, we currently have the estimation for the years 2023 and also 2031. So those are the 2 years that we have modeled air quality data for both ozone and PM2.5 concentrations. And for the rest of the years over the period of 2017 and 31, we will be using interpolated air quality model, air quality data to come up with quantified public health benefits. So what costs are we exactly quantifying? So in our socioeconomic report, we will be looking at the costs and quantify them for those measures with quantified emission reductions. And so those emission reductions, they will be ready to be committed into SIP. And also we expect that with this amount of emission reductions, it should be sufficient to bring us to the attainment targets by their respective attainment deadlines. And in terms of preliminary costs of the draft 2016 AQMP, so far we have quantified about $38.2 billion for all the control measures with quantified emission reductions. So just for your information, for those co-benefits control measures, where we will take the co-benefit emission reductions from existing programs and policies, from other government programs, for example, then we will consider that there is no incremental cost associated with those measures. And among those $38.2 billion of incremental costs that we have identified, almost 40% of them, we expect them to be paid by incentive programs, and the rest incurred by private entities. And so for SCAQMD stationary and also mobile source measures, we obtain the cost data and also assumptions from our internal rule staff. And for the CARP mobile source control measures, so we use the same underlying data and assumptions that are used for the state SIP in their economic analysis. Then in terms of the preliminary public health benefits, due to the modeled emission reductions in our draft 2016 AQMP, we expect that for the year 2023 alone, we will have an aggregate public health benefits of $26.9 billion. And for year 2031, due to the reduced exposure to the ambient air concentration, pollutant concentrations, then for the year, we will have benefits of almost $37 billion. And for the vast majority of these public health benefits, they will be associated with mortality-related health effects. So among all the mortality-related health effects, the majority of them, they will be related to the premature deaths avoided due to less exposure, long-term exposure to PM2.5. So we expect that more than 2,000 premature deaths will be avoided because of the less exposure due to lower air pollutant concentrations. And if we look at the spatial distribution of these health effects and health benefits, we will notice that the central Los Angeles County area will be experiencing the largest reductions in premature deaths avoided. So how do we come up with these estimates? It's not just a function of the air quality changes, it's also a function of the affected population. And so it is expected that we will see a huge reductions in the more populous areas, not just because of the air quality improvements, but also because there are a lot of people who will be benefiting from the lower mortality health risk. And as for every estimation, we know there are various sources of uncertainties. And those uncertainties can also have very different magnitudes and have very differential impacts on the final estimates. So we want to be upfront about the parameter values that we choose in order to arrive at these quantify public health benefits. And so there are two very important parameter choices that we have made based on the recommendations of our contractor, Industrial Economics, and also their scientific advisor, Dr. Lisa Robinson at Harvard University. So those two parameters, first one of them is the value of statistical life. So this is basically an aggregate measure of a society's willingness to pay to reduce the mortality health risks by a very small amount. And when you aggregate across the whole population, then you will arrive at, for example, the midpoint 9 million here is that you aggregate the lower health risk across the whole population in order to derive at 1 premature death avoided. And so our contractor recommended us to use a range of $4.2 to $13.7 million. And with the midpoint of $9 million. And another important parameter here is the income elasticity. So we are recommended to use 1.1 for the central estimate. So what does it mean? It basically means that when people's income increases by 1%, then we expect them to increase their willingness to pay for mortality health risk reduction by 1.1%. Therefore, as their income grows higher and higher, they will be more and more willing to pay for the mortality risk reductions. And the alternative values of 0 and 1.4 were also recommended to us for sensitivity analysis. So when we combine the lower end of the VSL range and also the lowest value of income elasticity, that is 0, then you will see the extreme lower bound for both 2023 and 2031, the public health benefits will be about $10 billion. But then when we combine the highest points for both VSL and also income elasticity, we see for 2023, we get public health benefits of almost $50 billion. And for 2031, that's about $71 billion. And as we mentioned earlier, morbidity-related public health benefits are really a very small part of the total quantified public health benefits. But nonetheless, we have included various health endpoints in order to look at the mobility-related benefits. So they can be related to short-term ozone exposure, both short-term and long-term PM2.5 exposure. And they include cardiovascular effects and also respiratory effects. And we also look at work load days, school load days, and also other minor restricted activity days in order to derive and arrive at this amount. So you will see more write-ups in the upcoming report that we'll be releasing in about 2 weeks. But in the meantime, if you have any questions for me or for my staff. Yes, Julia, please.
I'm willing to defer to the numbers first, but I just have a simple.
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay. One thing I would notice in the people have been sorry, thanks.
Oh, you did it.
Julia Lester, Rambo Environ. Referring to your slide on costs, people I think have been expressing a lot of concerns about incentives, but I think it's really important to look at what the breakout is. Because, for instance, of the 14.1 billion, 12.1 billion is from the CARB Mobile Source Program. But that isn't for the sources you think it might be. Actually, 11.6 billion of that is for the light-duty vehicles. And actually, 82% of all the funding is for light-duty vehicles. So cars, light-duty trucks. CARB has an extensive discussion also of how that's going to be distributed for lower-income people and things like that. But in terms of our attainment goals here, that's 82% of the incentive funding for a source that accounts for only 6% of the NOx reductions that we need. So I just wanted to point that out. When people think of incentives, I think people think of giveaways to industry, and that's really not what the CARB strategy says.
Just a comment on Julia's comment that when ARB does have a breakdown of funding for various mobile source sectors, when we did the analysis that's in Chapter 4 of the AQMP, we looked at various scenarios that included light-duty vehicle, but ultimately we looked at more cost-effective funding, which will be for heavy-duty vehicles and some of the other largest sources of NOx with a lower population of vehicle that would be more cost effective. And we do see a lower funding level need at that point. So we'll be looking at that as part of the socioeconomic analysis.
Yes, so we're still working with CARB on allocating whatever funding is available to the most cost-effective areas for NOx reductions, but also recognizing there's other goals within the state mobile source strategy when it comes to GHG reductions and other strategies. So, right now we're taking a conservative approach of including pretty much all the costs associated with a lot of those measures in the analysis, but some of those costs are due to other goals other than NOx reductions. So we're still working out some of the details of how that's going to be brought forward. And I do want to mention, and I think most of you realize this, when we're talking about the costs of the draft, that $38.2 billion is total cost over the entire time period. While when we talked about the benefits, somewhere between the range of 9 to 70 billion, those are annual benefits, right? That won't be the same every year, but will be interpolated year to year. So just to compare the numbers, one is an annual and one's a total. What's more appropriate is that average annualized cost on that, the sixth slide, page 2, bottom of page 2, that it's at 2.5 billion versus the 30 billion or so in monetized benefits. Sorry, and let me add one thing that I keep forgetting to add, and Wayne's going to keep kicking me. The 6 comment letters we talked about were the ones we received more or less before Thursday or Friday of last week. We got a slew over the weekend as well, and we're going to be getting more, including a slew of letters claiming that the PM 2.5 health impacts, mortality impacts in the basin are essentially zero.
Bill, could you speak up? Because even I'm having a hard time hearing. I'm sorry.
Can we get him a mic that works?
When Lane says that this 9 million is.
Bill. Yeah, take one that works.
How about now? When Elaine says that 9 million is a number that the public will pay, I guess, for the cost of healthcare.
No, that's not what it's saying. It's the willingness to pay to reduce mortality risk across the population. So the way I think of it is, how much are you willing to pay to reduce your risk of dying by 1 in 100 chances? Right. So maybe it's 90,000, then you scale that up to avoid a complete death would be 9 million.
Okay,
right?
And I'm probably a good example. I'm a cancer survivor. 3.5 years ago, I was diagnosed with esophageal cancer. I probably would have paid anything, but I don't happen to have $9 million in the bank. But anyway, so far I've survived that. But I don't think that your your reasoning stands, is subject to a lot of criticism because we're not seeing, we argued a little earlier here about jobs and businesses fleeing Southern California or all of California. Insurance companies are refusing to do business with Medicaid and Obamacare because of the high incidence of the people that they insure. So that's a problem. If individuals may want to pay more or pay whatever it is to keep them alive, but if insurance companies see this as a risk and are unwilling to cover that, I think your hypothesis just breaks down. It may work, in a computer model, but not in actual practice.
So we do recognize that we are measuring the public health benefits mostly based on the willingness to pay. And then you are correct to say that the willingness to pay doesn't mean that people do have the money in their bank or in their account to pay for it. But then still we want to put the price tag on how much they would be willing to pay for those. So we cannot be saying, for example, something like the poorer people should have a lower willingness to pay, or the richer people have a higher willingness to pay. So the way we characterize it is that it doesn't matter what your background is, there is a value to the reduced mortality risk. And maybe they cannot be purchased in the market, they do not exist in the economy, but then we do want to provide you with something comparable to the cost numbers. So you can compare the pros and cons of these proposed control measures. And then to go back to your question about how do they enter into the economy. So that would be the question how we model it in the RAMI impact analysis. And so where we will produce job impacts and also other macroeconomic impacts. And so we do recognize that we cannot directly put this quantified public health benefits into the economy as if there's money coming out of nowhere. So in the past practices, usually we model it as an amenity benefits. So the cleaner air will increase the regional amenities to attract more migrants to come here. And then therefore there will be the ripple effects of population increases and also job impacts. And this channel is still So there are a lot of discussions in the app reports regarding this channel, and we have been working with an outside consultant to look into this channel a little bit further. And so for the socioeconomic analysis that we will have for this draft, for the 2016 AQMP, we will be looking at different sensitivity analysis regarding this mechanism.
But again, a willingness to pay is nothing more than an ersatz or a faux benefit. I mean, it's not a real benefit.
An avoided premature death is a real benefit. The question is how can we put a value on that? And we didn't invent this concept of value as statistical life. It's been used for many, many years in the economic literature, and it was used back when you were trying to justify putting seatbelts in cars and how much that was going to cost and how much how many lives that was going to save. So it's not a new concept. The value and how you come up with that value, the methodology has changed over the years with the scientific and economic literature, but it's been used in past AQMPs obviously as well. Peter?
Does this one, oh, this one does work too. Good, oh, 2 in a row. Okay, thanks. I mean, I'm not going to go back over it, but obviously there's a lot of issues surrounding that VSL. And, it was interesting that the comment that was just made is, we know it doesn't exist and it's not in the economy. Well, the costs are existing and they are in the economy. So it seems like you're not putting together two things that even relate. And it's kind of like back in the early 2000s when they had stated income loans. And we know how well that went when 1997 came. So I think reality needs to come into play in this. And I doubt if this would stand up in any court of law. But moving on, so you're going to get more comments on that, obviously. I just had a question, actually, and it's on slide 6, which was your sort of summary of the mortality effects. And you have the phrase long-term PM 2.5 exposure. Can you define that? What is long-term PM 2.5 exposure as far as what led in then to your calculation?
That's just the annual standard. That's long-term is what we talk about when we talk about the annual standard and annual value versus short-term, which would be the 24-hour standard, I think. So we're talking about long-term health impacts versus the health impacts you might get from a single day of high exposure. But Elaine can
Yeah,
add
I
to
mean,
that.
if you're doing a calculation, I mean, is it, assuming somebody's there 24 hours a day, 365 days a year, or what?
So that's not what we do. So we basically look at the epidemiological studies where some of them, they look at the daily variations on the changes of incidences. And some of them, they look at the longer term metrics. So for example, the annual metrics, and to correlate it with the changes of incidences. So with regards to the long-term exposure due to PM 2.5, it's mostly because we are looking at those CR functions that are studied in those in the literature or studies that look at the longer term metrics. So it's not about expose somebody longer in PM 2.5. It's about the metrics that we are looking at, because, for example, some acute respiratory effects, they might be triggered by day-to-day variances of the concentrations. But then for other more chronic symptoms, they might be triggered by longer-term exposures.
Okay, so I mean, are you assuming then when you're talking about long-term PM 2.5 exposures, which is the annual standard, annual standard as opposed to 8 hour, that you're looking, I think there's about 16 million people in the basin, and then out of that, you get your numbers of premature deaths avoided?
Right. So we use a CR function combined with the affected population and also the baseline incidence rates in order to come up with those numbers.
Okay, what is affected population?
So affected population, in the case of mortality effects, it will be the whole basin's population.
Okay, even though we have numerous stations in the basin that are never out of the NAAQS standard.
Right. So I believe you are referring to the threshold effects. And so we basically assume that, again, based on our contractor's recommendation, that we do not assume any threshold effects. So the public health benefits that we quantify, that we assume that the public health benefits will continue to accrue even below the standards. And so that is based on the latest scientific evidence documented by US EPA in their integrated science assessments. And that's also consistent with the US EPA's current practice.
So the costs are based upon meeting NAAQS, but the benefits are based upon even going below NAAQS.
Right. So I
Again,
do not
that's
think
not
it's
that's not an equal,
No, it's
right.
equal analysis then.
but
Because the cost to get below NAAQS would be much higher.
But we're not the costs to get are mostly associated with getting to the ozone standard, but there will be benefits accrued on the PM 2.5 reductions that may be below the NAAQS. The PM 2.5 NAAQS. Right, exactly.
But you're
there's
taking
no
benefits below NAAQS. And the NAAQS are set on a health standard. So the federal government has said, here you meet the health needs of the public.
well the scientific evidence, EPA's procedures, the recommendation of our consultant and the health studies suggest that there are benefits that accrue even below the NAAQS. But we're not trying to get even additional below the NAAQS, but we're taking credit for the ozone attainment strategy will accrue other benefits as well above and beyond what the ozone benefits are. One of those is PM 2.5. You saw earlier that we get down to like 10 point something with implementation of the ozone strategy. Those are real benefits from the ozone strategy. The ozone strategy is just to get to the NAAQS, but then there's other benefits that accrue. But I want to come back to another thing you said about comparing apples and oranges. These aren't really in the economy. Where it does come together is willingness to pay. There's individuals' willingness to pay, but there's also societal willingness to pay for avoided premature deaths and risk of premature death. There's also societal willingness to pay when it comes to, regulatory, regulations, and it's business and what some of it's consumers, some of it's government, wherever those costs end up. But in aggregate, there's a willingness to pay on both sides. How much is society willing to pay to reduce risk? So the two numbers can be comparable in that sense.
Phil, I also wanted to add one point is that although we say that the willingness to pay is not directly money that you can put into the economy, but then the improved public health does have a lot of indirect economic benefits. So for example, there was a recent study by Eason et al. And so they documented that because of the reductions in early childhood or in utero exposure to air pollutants, then they find 30 years later, among this cohort of children, their labor participation rate is much higher. It means that, so as a child, if you are less exposed to air pollutants, air pollution, then when you become an adult, when you're 30 years old, it's more likely for you to hold a job. So for sure, there's some long-term economic benefits associated with this, which we do not quantify here.
Okay, so let's, in the interest of time, it's getting late. Let's move this way and start with Chris.
So given that you guys are doing sort of a boundary sensitivity analysis on the health costs or accrued benefits, I know we've submitted some comments to the Air Resources Board on some potential, let's say, ranges of potential costs for some of the control measures, given the fact that we're looking at control measures for a lot of advanced technologies where there's a lot of speculation about what the actual compliance costs might be, things like infrastructure installation, updating transformers at warehousing facilities. Will you guys take comments on potential ranges of compliance costs to consider in the regulatory piece of the analysis that you guys are doing as well?
Yeah, absolutely. All comments are welcome.
My next, thanks, Philip.
Yeah.
Quick public service announcement before my comment, which is I think the 15 freeway is closed through the Cajon Pass by a brush fire, which I noticed as I was coming out here, sitting in traffic. I don't know, this was about an hour ago or so. It'd be worth checking your phones to see.
We have an advisory out for smoke exposure.
My question probably is less on the health effects and probably more for Philip and Henry on the near zero versus the zero technologies. And there were so many different points in the presentations today where we were looking at both near zero and zero. I'm wondering, and I don't know, how well you've addressed this yet in the documents, but it seems to me it would be very valuable to make sure that you analyze the near zero benefits versus the zero benefits and the relative ability to reach the zero technologies. The natural gas trucks are an example now that we've got the substantial reduction in the near zero truck technology that's dropped everything by a full order of magnitude in terms of NOx emissions. And that's still, it's commercial, but it's still in the early stages. And how you've gone about making your decisions about choosing whether to favor near zero or zero over what time frame and the net benefits that come associated with each of those technologies as we go ahead. You understanding where I'm going on this, Philip?
Yeah.
It seems to me it's a combination of behavioral science and economics and technology that you have to weave together. And I think it will serve the AQMP well if you've been very straightforward about how you've tried to look at that. First of all, those tend to be areas where people are feel very strongly and emotionally, but also trying to figure out that. And I'm not sure there are going to be any perfect answers where you can get an algorithm that'll tell you that it's better to switch to the near zero or the zero at a certain point. But how you do that and how you look at it seems to me to be very important.
I think I would refer back to our 10 white papers, especially the goods movement and the passenger transportation, where we did look at zero and near zero and what those effects are in 2030, in 2023 and 2031. So we have looked at that.
I think I think a lot of it is, I mean, I think overarching principle is zero wherever feasible and possible, and then near zero, especially for the 2023 target, where it's just not going to be available and feasible in many, many applications, if I had to boil it down to one piece. But it's something we have thought about when we're looking at SQL alternatives, for instance. But one problem is it doesn't meet at least one of the project objectives, which is attainment in 2023, because there's no way to get there with zero. Yeah,
But it
Michelle.
goes back to the old, don't let the perfect stand in the way of the good, or the very good. So that's the challenge, and figuring out how you do, I mean, being very open about how you do the analysis is, I think, essential for people looking at the AQMP from the outside.
So Michelle.
Yeah, this is more of just a request for kind of a further disaggregation of the data for when we meet in the socioeconomic assessment. If it's at all possible to disaggregate the cost and benefit, if it's related to, say, the co-benefits of other programs, of other programs maybe that CARB has. And also curious to know if you could disaggregate the cost, the public health cost, maybe per income, community of color, and maybe even region, if at all possible. I know it's a lot of data, but it would really help the assessment.
So regarding the benefits, we will be looking at the EJ versus non-EJ areas. So they should be highly correlated with the income level and also communities of color as well, and also other indicators that we have included in the screening analysis.
I meant the co-benefits of like programs, if the cost, if the benefits of the savings and are more attributable to programs by CARB, or are they more attributable to this plan? You know what I mean? Like if it's more a result of kind of mobile strategies that are under the purview of CARB, or if it's more a result of this actual plan. Just it would be interesting to see that.
So currently we're not able to do that because we get the model data as for the AQMP as a whole. Yeah. And another thing is that for the benefits, for co-benefits, we do not consider there's any incremental cost.
Okay. Chris, you all right?
Yeah, just to follow up on Tom's comment, I think what would be helpful for our analysis, it was the second part of my question, I forgot, is if we could get a breakdown of the cost for the individual control measures and how they were apportioned into the district. Because I know that, you know, roughly the tons, but how the cost for the individual control measures were apportioned into this analysis.
Okay. Rob?
Oh, this works. This works. I have a general question on the AQMP in terms of meteorology. This question was triggered by the recent article in the LA Times about adverse weather this summer and surprisingly high ozone levels and so on. So my general question is, we know that because of climate change, we're seeing. It's probably better that way. We're seeing more extremes in weather, both hotter weather, colder weather, that type of thing. We all know this, and we're all seeing this. We're seeing patterns now that said, geez, maybe 1 in 1,000 years this will happen, or et cetera, and we're seeing more frequency of this. So my question is, very simple question, but, and that is, let's say we have a really bad year of weather, an extreme year of weather where everything works against us, and or maybe a couple, 3 years or something like that. Like right now we have a bit of a drought. But the question then is, and so we're actually seeing higher values of say ozone than we had ever anticipated. Do we get penalized for that? Or, for example, is there something in EPA's regs that says something about not only extreme events, but extreme events of meteorology, and that may only occur once every 1,000 years? So that's my question.
Currently, EPA has not accepted any of those types of arguments. They are currently opening up the exceptional events rule and having workshops towards the end of the year. I'm sure some comments will be made to that effect, but currently I'm not aware they've ever approved that type of that finding for exceptional events, but maybe Barbara.
Okay, I'll use one that's already on. There's actually provisions in the Clean Air Act that address this issue also, and they do mention periods of low precipitation as not being something that can be considered for exceptional events, and also periods of stagnation of air masses, which is one of our issues here, but we pretty much have those all the time. So it would be difficult for them to define an exceptional event that would include that. But there has been, in this year Congress, there was a bill proposed that would have altered those definitions, but it didn't go anywhere. And it seems to us like a potential real slippery slope if we want to try and go down that argument.
So I will just add a little minor comments on that as well. So as a part of the AQMP analysis, we also have done some simple linear regression to account for the changes in weather conditions, so like changes in precipitation pattern. So 2012, which is the base year of current AQMP, is in terms of precipitation-wise more or less average year. And then we have done analysis, what if the severe drought persistent in the future attainment years, and what if more like a linear situation, more precipitation occurs in the future attainment years. And then we have quantified very simple way, but it's like few microgram per meter cube of the buffer or the changes could occur with certain different meteorological condition. So one thing is, even though EPA is not strictly required to it, we kind of performed some extra analysis and included in the discussion. And then secondly, as you mentioned, this year is extreme hot year and then really high ozone years. But let's say 5 years down the road, when we are doing another round of AQMP to address a 70 ppb standard, then when we do attainment demonstration, we have to use 5-year weighted design value. Then one of those 5 years highly likely included 2016, which has 170 ppb ozone measured already. So in certain sense, indirectly, those high concentrations are already incorporated into attainment demonstration. So, but not indirectly, but indirectly sense. So.
Elaine, you had something to add?
Is it on?
So it's not just you guys, it's...
Thank you. Just to respond to Chris' comment, a question. So we actually already put out a preliminary cost summary by control measure, and then you can find that on our SCAQMPR website for our July 28th meeting. And so in our preliminary report, we will include that table as well, but an updated table to that. Sure. Yeah.
We can do that. That's fine. Okay. Any other comments on that item? And Nancy.
It's getting worse and worse.
Barbara tried and didn't work.
Are we green? Hi. Nancy Pfeffer, Gateway Cities Council of Governments. Just to clarify, did I hear something correctly that was said a few minutes ago, that you can't in your modeling distinguish between the benefits from CARB strategies versus the effects of the benefits of AQMD strategies? Did I understand that right or no?
So currently, the way socioeconomic analysis is done is, so we have baseline scenario, meaning that there is no additional measures or regulations introduced other than already adopted ones. That's the future baseline. And then with that emission scenario, we have future year air quality concentrations. And then we have modeling attainment scenario, meaning that 45% NOx reduction is expected to meet the 80 ppb standard. So that is we call attainment scenario or controlled scenario. Then we have air quality concentration predicted at every location within the basin with that emission scenario. Then you calculate the difference of the two, and then that concentration, this delta in concentration is interpreted into health benefits and economic benefits. So in principle, in the modeling perspective, we have done sensitivity analysis that splits out this CARB strategy only, how far the cleaner air, the CARB strategy only get to, versus CARB strategy and then South Coast AQMD strategy, combined strategy get to. So sensitivity test-wise, we have conducted that, and then we can discuss further, probably expand it to socioeconomic analysis if we need to.
So let me just address this. So again, it's hard because the way that the socioeconomic benefits are calculated, you just look at air quality from the plan. But from a rough approximation, if you look at the emission reductions attributable to, say, CARB strategy versus stationary sources, or however you want to divide it up, you could probably apportion the benefits roughly about the same. And that would save us a lot of work from running model run after model run after model run, which may be slight differences when you put the emissions in different places. But in a rough sense, apportioning it by emission should probably get you pretty close.
And also one more thing is the benefits of the two strategies are not linear, meaning that you just combine CARB strategy and then district strategy together is not the total benefit. Total benefit is much larger than the simple sum of the two. So it is not fair analysis.
I just want to add one quick thing on the benefit. The benefit estimates that Elaine presented is only for the health benefit. This is the first AQMP. Yeah, all the numbers that you've seen so far is only for health benefit. So this is the first AQMP that we are not going to include visibility benefit and agricultural and material benefit. So we are going to only qualitatively address those. So the numbers that you see here is only health benefit, and it's kind of a conservative way of looking at the benefits in total.
Okay, any other comments or questions on this item? All right, anything else the advisory group wants to bring up? Other business? Public comment period? Everyone's walking out. I take that as a no. Or are you walking? Are you walking up or are you walking out? Okay, so thank you everyone for coming and hanging in there, and we'll probably set up the next meeting. We'll be looking at when we can get a revised draft out, and it'll probably be, hopefully soon after that, we would get another meeting together to talk about the changes.